When you hear the word unfavorable, you might think of the Republican and Democratic frontrunners. Our next guest, though, says history says that this is not the first time a candidate who seemed unpopular could wind up in the Oval Office. Doug Cohn is presidential historian, also author of The President's First Year, and has made a study of this kind of thing. Has there ever been a campaign like this? I mean, in terms of past history, how would you compare this primary season?
Oh, this one doesn't come close to 1860. 1860, Abraham Lincoln was running against 3 other people. He wasn't even on the ballot in 10 southern states, and he was finally elected with 39% of the popular vote. So he has to go down in history as the single most negative elected president. So
negatives don't necessarily mean that you're not going to win the presidency, first of all, and not going to do well in the second case.
Well, you actually get into a different subject here, because you get into the idea of plurality presidents, and the primary plurality presidents have been Abraham Lincoln, Woodrow Wilson, and Bill Clinton. And in each case, they had more than one candidate that they were running against. And in each case, in the case of Bill Clinton and Abraham Lincoln, they won with 39% of the vote. Woodrow Wilson won with about 41% of the vote. And that's not what you would call a mandate. And there were problems that emanated from that.
Well, when we talk about some of the front runners, 65% of the voters say they could not see themselves supporting Donald Trump. 61% say they could not back Ted Cruz. 58% say they couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton. One of those people is likely to win this office, aren't they?
Well, that's why negative views do not always result in negative votes. So that what people do is they vote for someone they did not care for in the first place, but you're going to still end up with a president, in most cases, who ends up with near a majority. Now, by majority, you can actually call it an actual majority, 48 to 49%, because you can get write-in candidates and other strange things. But it's when you have more than 2 candidates running that you end up with plurality candidates, and that's when the negative vote aspect really shows itself. But in this coming election, that's not going to happen. They're going to end up voting for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, which, by the way, Donald Trump is going to be the nominee. I've run the figures myself. His internal polling shows that he's going to have 1,400 votes. My work shows he's going to have about 1,500 votes. So unless something cataclysmic happens, he's going to be the nominee. Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee, and this is who we're going to contend with, 2 highly negative candidates.
Well, those candidates, once they reach the office, always face a first year that is different from anything they ever expected. I know you've made a study of that. We'll ask you about that when we come back. Doug Cohn. Doug Cohn is back with us, presidential historian and author of The President's First Year. Doug, we are getting indications from the Trump campaign that the rough and tumble manner that he has maintained during the primary season thus far is about to change, that we're going to see a more refined and presidential Donald Trump. Has any other candidate in the past done the same kind of thing, pivoted ahead of the general election?
All the candidates pivot to some degree. Richard Nixon was famous for saying run to the right for Republicans in the primaries and run to the center in the general election. But the classic case, of course, was Andrew Jackson. He was a rough-cut frontiersman, and he brought a very egalitarian nature to the office. But once he got into office, he became far more presidential, and that's the primary comparison to Donald Trump, frankly.
And I know that you have studied presidential first years in office. Everybody faces challenges they were not expecting. What looks to be ahead for whoever wins this race?
The interesting thing is once they take office, they don't know what they're going to get. And it's the same thing you find in any organization. It's always easier to be the second or third person rather than be the leader. And when somebody takes the leadership role and they're actually responsible for their actions, it's a whole different system. And that's why none of these people are prepared for it. The 2 things that make a person most prepared historically are if they've shown personal courage, particularly in a combat situation, and have a solid knowledge of history. Theodore Roosevelt, John Kennedy both fell into those categories. The people running now do not have that. Neither one of them would be considered an historian. Neither one of them have particularly shown any area of personal courage. So what they're going to be facing are some very, very tough decisions coming up.
We were talking about this earlier with our media panel. What about the current occupant of the Oval Office? Didn't have a lot of political experience, campaigned on hope and change. How would you assess Barack Obama's first year in office?
He made mistakes in his first year like all of the others. His primary mistake in his first year is he put most of his marbles on the Health Care Act, and he got that through, but in doing so he managed to lose Congress, and he's had an uphill battle with that ever since. He also had a learning curve on foreign policy, but he's been picking up steam on that. His poll numbers have actually been improving recently.
Well, speaking of the president's foreign policy, he is meeting with British Prime Minister David Cameron.